Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to all the audience from around the world. Thank you all for joining us for this interactive discussion as part of the webinar on internal carbon pricing. My name is Alsbera Klein. I'm a Director and Global Head of Climate Business in IFC, and I'll be moderating today's discussion with Unilever and with Ecofys. But first and foremost, a special thank you to our partners, World Economic Forum, Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, and Yale University. So before we start, we would like to hear some housekeeping announcements from Yale University. Yale?
Hello, everyone. Before we get started, we have two housekeeping items to announce. One is on the software's question and answer functionality, and the second is a note from our lawyers. First, this webinar series is designed to be an open, interactive conversation, and you are invited to submit your questions via the Q&A function at any point during the event. You can find the Q&A in the menu bar at the top of your screen. Due to time constraints, we will not be able to address every question submitted today, but we'll answer as many as possible. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. Second, we would like to draw your attention to the following statement, which is being displayed on your screen currently, and I read now. Throughout this webinar series, participants shall comply with competition law requirements and shall not enter into any discussion, activity, or conduct that may infringe any applicable competition law. By way of example, participants shall not discuss, communicate, or exchange any commercially sensitive information, including non-public information relating to prices, marketing and advertising strategy, costs and revenues, strategy in relation to decisions on internal project screening values, trading terms and conditions with third parties, including purchasing strategy, terms of supply, trade, or distribution strategy. This applies not only to discussions during formal meetings, but also to informal discussions before, during, and after meetings. Should the meeting discuss matters that contravene competition law requirements, it is the responsibility of participants to notify the moderator, who will discontinue the discussion or close the meeting. Many thanks for your attention, and I will now turn it back to Alsbera Klein, Director and Global Head, Climate Business of IFC, to moderate the webinar.
Thank you very much, Yale. Very much appreciated. So for those of you who just joined, my name is Alsbera Klein. I'm a Director and Global Head of Climate Business in IFC. Very briefly about IFC, we are part of the World Bank Group, and we invest in private companies only in emerging markets. And climate is one of our strategic priorities over the past 5-6 years. We are very interested and very active in the space of carbon pricing, and we are working on three different levels. We are working in countries to define country-specific outreach to large companies in emerging markets, examples from Brazil and India and others abound. We're also doing deep sector dives where we engage banking sector, we engage green construction value chain, and other sectors to identify opportunities for using carbon pricing in a sector. And last but not least, we're also walking the talk. And as a financial institution, we are ourselves working to apply carbon price to our investments. And we are sharing our experience through Carbon Price Leadership Coalition with other banks. So what are we going to do today? We are going to be talking about carbon pricing because it is the topic of the day. According to CDP, over 1,300 companies today are using or planning to use carbon pricing within the next 2 years, and we have seen an increase of over 11% from 2016. Today, we are going to hear from Unilever, a leader in sustainability, how they are integrating internal price of carbon to achieve their climate goals. We'll be followed by Ecofys. Ecofys is a leading consultancy that have recently released practical guides for carbon pricing. So a warm welcome to our panelists. We are going to start with Unilever, and I'd like to welcome Thomas Lindgaard, who is a Global Director of Climate and Environment. I'd like to welcome Roger Seabrook, who is Vice President of Finance, Marketing, and Sustainability. And I'd like to welcome Sabine Nealon, Finance Director of Sustainability. Unilever, the floor is yours.
Alsbera, thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm Roger Seabrook. I'm the VP Finance for Marketing and Sustainability. And today I'm joined by two colleagues.
I'm Sabine Nealon, Finance Director Sustainability. And I'm Thomas Lingard. I lead climate change and sustainability strategy within our Chief Sustainability Office.
So today we're going to share with you a little bit of Unilever's sustainability journey and a little of our experience with internal carbon pricing. We're going to share some examples of what we're doing and some of the things we've learned along the way. But it's fair to say up front that we're clear that we don't have all the answers. And indeed, many of you will be facing similar challenges to those that we're facing. We're certainly hoping that what we'll be able to share with you will be of some use to you and can stimulate a bit of a conversation about how we make more progress. So you can see on the screen the agenda that we're going to follow. We're not going to speak for very long in order to leave some time for questions. So with no further ado, let me kind of start by giving you a bit of an overview of the context for internal carbon pricing and carbon pricing in Unilever. And that context is the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. This was launched in 2010, and it's a comprehensive plan which looks at various aspects of Unilever's contribution to sustainable development. So you can see on the screen the sort of three big goals that we set ourselves, and then underneath it you can see the pillars that we then break those down into in terms of the actions we're actually going to take. And underpinning all of this was our vision to decouple our growth from our environmental impact, whilst increasing our positive social impact of the business and our brands. So clearly today what we're not going to try and do is discuss all the elements of the plans. You'll be able to find a lot more if you wish on our website under the Sustainable Living Plan part. But I just wanted to kind of draw your attention on this chart to the circle around greenhouse gases and water. So a key pillar of our plan was to halve the emissions of our products for consumer use across the full value chain. And that's our big goal. So I think it's really worth emphasizing that the Sustainable Living Plan aims to operate across our complete value chain. But having said that, we realized we also needed to do everything that we could in terms of our own activities, our own factories, our own operations. And so what we've done is we've set our targets, which we believe to be stretching targets, to ensure our manufacturing emissions continue to fall over time. So that was all launched in 2010. As we then progressed and learned and came towards the Paris Climate Change Conference, we then announced change to those targets, and we made them more aggressive in terms of our carbon emissions. So on the chart at the bottom, you can see that by 2030, we've now made the commitment that we would be carbon positive in our own operations by that time. So that means that we would aim to generate more renewable energy than we actually consume and make the surplus available to our markets and communities where we operate. And then in order to get there, we set milestones. And again, you can see them on the chart in terms of, for example, sourcing 100% of our grid electricity from renewable sources by 2020, and then aiming to have 100% of our total energy demand, both heat and power, from renewable sources by 2030. So it's this ambition and it's this goal that we've set, which really puts the context for our decision to introduce internal carbon pricing. A bit more of the context before we dive into the absolute details of what we've done, because I think we only see carbon pricing as part of a suite of activities that we have in place to address this and to try and make the economy and our business within that economy a low carbon and sustainable business. So for example, back in 2014, we were one of the first companies to sign the World Bank's statement on carbon pricing, calling for governments to use carbon pricing as a tool to address climate change. So, we'd already made public statements about that. We think that carbon pricing is a key tool. It's only one of them. It needs to be seen in context of others. For example, carbon disclosure. And those of you who followed this in detail will know that we've been working also with the Task Force on Climate Disclosure. So that's another key element of this. But we do see carbon pricing as a key part of moving this agenda forward. And then in 2015, we signed up to the UN Global Compact's business leadership criteria on carbon pricing, which meant going beyond just advocating carbon pricing externally, but also to show leadership by adopting carbon pricing approaches internally as well. And that, of course, is what we're aiming to share with you today. So we've done various other things. We've supported other activities locally. For example, in the United States, we've been a founding member of the Climate Leadership Council and so on. But having given all of that context and the commitments we've made, clearly now we need to kind of reflect upon, what have we actually done and what have we learned as we've been applying carbon pricing within our business. So with that, I'll hand over to Sabina to take you through Unilever's approach.
Thank you, Roger. In order for us to achieve our ambition of having 100% renewable energy across all Unilever sites, eliminate coal from our manufacturing, and actually help us drive informed decisions relating to product design, corresponding carbon impact of sites, we need a more disruptive approach. So we believe there are a number of ways in which carbon price can help us internally. So first, our approach to carbon pricing has been designed to deliver against 5 objectives. So first, the carbon cost becomes visible when decisions are being made and in a unit which all the business leaders are actually familiar. So if we find that this places greater attention to finding solutions to reduce impact of carbon. While it's difficult for most of us to understand what it means when we talk about 50,000 tons of CO2 when we're discussing the actual project, we can quickly understand if we convert that to euro 2 million, which from materiality point of view, we can all relate to. Secondly, it serves to help decision makers to understand the long-term cost of carbon and help us build a roadmap to reduce that impact. Imagine having not only cost per ton roadmap in a traditional sense, but being able to actually look at benchmarking factors based on that metric. Given that we have committed to being carbon positive and 100% renewable everywhere, it is important that everybody in Unilever understand that roadmap. Third, it helps us actually future-proof against the future carbon taxes. Today, we are not significantly impacted, but we expect that issue to grow. Fourth approach is this approach is designed to hold decision-making makers that are accountable for decisions to look at both positive and negative impact of sustainability outcomes. We may still go ahead in some of the decisions when the project has adverse impact. For example, if we think that carbon price is unlikely to materialize during the lifetime of that asset, but it will be far more visible, and decision makers will be making decisions based on all the information that they have. And then finally, the scheme has to be more than a paper exercise. It has to help us actually reduce our carbon emissions, and we will talk in a moment about how we do that. Okay, so what we have actually done, in order for the implementation of carbon price to have a desired impact on the business, Unilever have implemented 2 separate but complementary approaches to internal carbon pricing. First is the shadow carbon price for our CapEx projects. Our steering team agreed a policy to apply a shadow carbon price to CapEx decisions over 1 million and make the information available to the decision makers. We then apply that price to the cash flow analysis of CapEx decision and show results with and without the impact of internal cost of carbon. We use the analysis as one of the factors in driving the final decisions between alternative courses of action. So the second approach is the internal clean tech fund. So for this approach, we calculated the internal cost of carbon of the manufacturing emissions for each global business unit. We then reduce this business unit's CapEx budget by this amount and place this funds in a centrally controlled clean tech CapEx fund. We'll talk a bit more later on when we have examples. But let's look at the first of our carbon pricing approaches, the CapEx project shadow carbon price, where I can share with you 2 examples that we actually do in practice. So the first example is our South Africa. In South Africa, we needed to replace a heavy fuel oil boiler. Heavy fuel oil boilers are typically cheaper and need low capital investment. So at first, this makes it easier and obvious decision to continue using these boilers. However, because of the high carbon emissions, we decided to look at a low carbon alternative. The biomass boiler that seems to be more environmentally friendly alternative. So let's see what we had as the results. We found that extending our analysis beyond only the capital expenditure required, that overall cost of biomass boiler was in fact already cheaper as it had low annual running costs each year. This means that based on the total cost, we would actually choose the biomass boiler even without a carbon price. This would also satisfy our desire to buy a more environmentally friendly boiler. So it's, in a way, it's a win-win decision. To check if this, what would happen with the impact on our decision if we apply the carbon prices to the future cash flows, what we've done is we're incorporating a carbon price and we've seen the increase in cost of the heavy fuel oil boiler, and that confirmed our decision. So in this case, applying carbon price didn't actually change our decision, but supported it. So our second example is from Turkey, and it relates to our refrigeration system. So in our case, I should say up front that our policy is not to use HFC system where legal alternatives exist because of their high GHG impact. But this case is useful to show how carbon pricing analysis can actually support that policy. And in some cases, if the company doesn't have that policy, it can help replace it when that policy doesn't exist. So there are two options in theory. First, to use as HFC refrigerant system, and a second to invest in a refrigeration which uses ammonia as a refrigerant. So HFCs have high carbon emissions and contribute to the global warming, while ammonia has a low emissions. So without actually doing any further analysis, the more environmental friendly choice would be refrigeration, which uses ammonia. However, our CapEx decision, as usually, always involves doing the financial analysis. So we've done that, and HFC and ammonia refrigeration options both actually had very similar CapEx investment and very similar ongoing costs each year. So we actually seen a slightly cheaper overall, that HFC's refrigeration was slightly cheaper. Without a specific policy that would prohibit Unilever using HFCs, that would be our decision, and we might have chosen the HFCs unit. However, let's see what happens when we actually put the carbon price into our analysis. So we apply the cost of carbon, and it's actually increased the cost of HFC refrigeration incrementally more than for the ammonia's equipment. This told us that taking into account a long-term environmental impact, ammonia refrigeration was the cheaper option. This is an example where applying the carbon price could result indeed in a change in the decision, especially if the company doesn't have a separate policy on prohibiting HFC's freezers, though it would need to be applied to all emissions, not only CO2 from energy. So that's how our shadow pricing approach to CapEx decision works. Now let us have a look at the second approach, which is our clean tech fund. As I mentioned earlier, the clean tech fund was created by reducing or taxing internal CapEx budgets by applying our cost of carbon to the business unit's emissions in the previous years. So Unilever today has an annual fund of about 50 million, and the investments from that fund are prioritized based on a real simple scale, looking at the impact of carbon and their financial viability. So the process is very transparent to ensure that the optimal choices are made, both from carbon and cost perspective. We're actually using this very similar, the same hurdle rates and the same payback period metrics when we're looking at these projects. The examples where we actually invested in sustainability initiatives includes the following. So we have solar thermal installation in Kenya, we have biomass replacement of coal in South Africa, LED lighting in Australia, and condensate recovery solution in Chile. So, and now we can go more into learnings from these two approaches.
Thank you, Sabina. So there you have the two different elements of Unilever's carbon pricing approach, and we can take different learnings from each. So thinking first about the shadow carbon price, what we've seen is that, first of all, this depends on the ability to perform a really good comparative analysis of two different options. And I just say that up front because it also requires that we have the technical expertise as a business to understand not only what we would have done, a kind of business as usual option, but also to have the expertise in the alternatives that are available. It's not simply the case of picking two options and running the carbon numbers. To do that with confidence, you've got to be sure that the alternative you might be looking at, that might be a novel technology but lower carbon, that you have confidence in that piece of equipment as well. It's not just about the numbers, it's about being sure it's the right decision for the business. And if you don't get that right, then you find people not wanting to run the numbers, not because of the numbers themselves, but because they don't, want to maybe admit that they haven't understood everything about biomass boilers or anything about the alternative technologies. So it's not just about the carbon issues here. I think the second thing is that you have to then get that data. So you have to be sure that the data you're getting about the carbon costs and benefits are going to be accurate over time in order to have confidence in that. And the other thing that we've learned that's a particular learning for our kind of business is we're not a very energy intensive business. And as you've seen from some of the examples, the NPV effect of including a carbon price, even a sort of moderate one of 40 euros a tonne, is not in many cases swaying the decision for us, as if we were, as you might expect in a much more energy intensive business. So while we're very happy to implement that policy and are still using it, it's not been a massive driver in shifts of decisions in the kinds of capital expenditure projects that we're making. One other complexity, I suppose, of the shadow carbon pricing approach is it's an approximation of where we think real economy carbon prices will go. This is a tool which has most value if we have a high degree of confidence that carbon pricing is likely to bite in real terms within the lifetime of the asset. If it is just a paper exercise, if it's an asset in a country where we have zero hope that there will be carbon pricing implemented, it's very hard for that analysis to have any weight in the decision making. That's why we are in parallel being very active on advocacy to ensure that we get carbon prices implemented by governments around the world. So there's always going to be this element of judgment about when a carbon price is likely to become real within the lifetime of an asset. So let's look at learnings of the Clean Tech Fund. So our Clean Tech Fund came in after the shadow pricing approach, in part as a response to some of those challenges. And we found this to be very helpful. It attracts the attention of decision makers because they start with a notional capital expenditure budget, and then they have some of that taken away, and how much they get taken away is based on their emissions in the prior year. So this really does focus the mind of business decision makers. It has been very important to have strong leadership from our supply chain teams. We've been thrilled to have that. Everybody is really behind this fund, very excited by it. And I think one of the reasons for that is because of the central fund, which also then the same business leaders who've lost their capital budgets can bid to get it back for some often quite iconic low carbon projects. It makes very visible the investments that Unilever is making as a whole in low carbon technologies, and these projects become kind of famous internally within the supply chain community and the wider Unilever community as examples of really great things we're doing. So there is a kind of communications benefit to operating the scheme in this way that just helps keep people really excited about the journey that we're on. This also allows us to channel the capital expenditure that we want to make in low carbon projects to the very best ones, the ones with that both achieve the sort of normal commercial hurdle rate for Unilever, but also which deliver the most emissions reduction for that investment, which is really important given the stretching targets we've got to reduce our emissions. And the other thing that we found is that we know that some companies have looked at carbon pricing schemes in conjunction with offsets in order to make a more immediate claim about being carbon neutral or whatever. But we find it's a better business case to keep those funds within the business and use them within our own scope 1 and 2 emissions to drive down those emissions at a more accelerated rate. We've also found it's been very helpful to have a strong governance process around this, so that there's very clear and transparent decision making around which budgets are being reduced, where is that money going, and then how that money is being spent, and that keeps everybody very happy with how this is working. Now, before we conclude, we wanted to mention 2 other carbon pricing schemes. Now, Unilever is a very big business, and we have been over a number of years acquiring smaller and different exciting businesses. And one of the characteristics of how Unilever often works with acquisitions is we often leave them to continue to run rather than to try and interfere with them too much. And in doing so, we found we've got a number of businesses, we're just going to talk about 2 here today, that have taken a different approach to carbon pricing. And we're not saying it's better or worse, but they're different. And we thought we'd just share those in case they spark some thoughts. So Ben & Jerry's, a lot of people know Ben & Jerry's, delicious ice cream product, and also very active on climate change and very active in talking to their consumers about climate change too. And they've adopted a much wider scope of a carbon pricing scheme. So they look at the full scope 3 emissions, including the production and use of their ice cream. About 40% or so of the emissions is linked to the dairy production that goes into the milk and cream for the ice cream. So a very wide scope, but a lower carbon price of $10. And they use that not to drive kind of capex decisions, but they use that to create a fund to invest in projects that aim to reduce emissions in the value chain, whether that's looking at particular feeds for cows that help reduce emissions, or sustainable refrigeration or transportation or things like that. So it's a different kind of scheme altogether with a very different objective. And Seventh Generation, which is a laundry business, again with a very environmental, ecological positioning in the market, has also got a carbon pricing scheme. They use the funds from that for a whole variety of things, including some operational costs linked to being more sustainable, also with carbon offsets, also supporting manufacturing and distribution partners. It's again a very different kind of scheme, and much more tied into the fact that as a brand, these are stories it wants to be telling to its consumers about what it stands for. So just two additional examples there from the Unilever family. So just to wrap up then with some conclusions, we've shared the learnings around our shadow pricing approach to CapEx, and the Clean Tech Fund, and from Ben & Jerry's and Seventh Generation. We don't claim this to be a perfect carbon pricing solution. This is really our sort of first stab at trying to get this right. We have found that different types of scheme drive different types of outcome and can be used for different purposes. So being clear on what you're trying to do with the carbon pricing scheme is really important to getting this right and agreeing that up front. We found that for non-energy intensive businesses, the shadow carbon pricing approach is interesting and helpful to think about some of these longer term costs, but it may not have big impacts in decision making. But that these visible carbon fund approaches, where you are taking money away from people, punishing them for having too high emissions, really plays to everybody's competitive mindset in the business world, and nobody likes having money taken away from them. And so that has proven to be, from a human point of view, quite a good driver of internal behaviour change. So yes, that's I think where we'll finish for today, and very happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent, Unilever. Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you, Sabina. Thank you, Thomas. So I'd like to encourage our participants to put up questions. We've got quite a few questions coming in, streaming in. So I'd like to bucket it into 3 categories. What we are getting is what I would call hard questions about how you went about it and what exactly it covers. Then we've got a bucket of soft questions. What were the issues and policy considerations and your management's uptake on that? And then we've got a few questions on the future and impact. So maybe we can start with a couple of hard questions about how you went about it and what it means. So a question came in whether you apply this to all your operations, and you touched upon already on the subsidiaries and how you handle that. How did you get to 40? How did you get to $40? And the question whether you took into account Stern Stiglitz's consideration in the recent study that was done, or how did you actually go about it? What is the payback period you use in shadow pricing? And how did you decide about the two approaches? So maybe we can take this as a first round before we go to the next one.
Okay, so let me sort of have a first go at that, and then my colleagues will no doubt pick me up on the things that I missed. You know, as we said in terms of the context, the initiative to do this was very much decided at the senior levels. You know, we were clear where we wanted to go in terms of the business. We were clear that we wanted to look at the impact that carbon pricing, internal carbon pricing, could have on getting us there. And of course, we want to have the biggest impact on our business. So when the original pilot was signed off a couple of years ago, we agreed to apply it to the majority of our business. So it's not that we've done a little pilot in one place or another. It is true to say that we focused on the core, you know, the main part of our business. We haven't applied the approach to every single small acquisition that's been made in recent years, but we applied it to the bulk of the business. And I suppose the simplification we made, if you like, is we applied it first of all to CapEx projects above €1 million. Now, you know, we can argue, I guess, about whether that's a lot of money or not a lot of money, but we focused it on the bigger capital projects, thinking that that's the place where we're likely to have the biggest carbon emissions.
So, Roger, just a quick question. So what do you reckon would be your coverage? Are we talking 80% of your business? Are we talking 50% of your business? What would that threshold mean in reality?
So look, in terms of what would come into scope to be looked at, it would be 80% of business plus, I expect, because you know, the capital expenditure of the smaller parts would be relatively small. But as I said, the number, if you took the total number of capital proposals, it would be far smaller than that, because we're just looking at the bigger capital proposals.
Okay. And
then there was a question on the carbon price. We could have done detailed studies on this, but of course, people much cleverer than me anyway have already done those. So to start with, what I did was I did some research, and we got some partners to do some research with us, and we literally captured all the carbon prices that companies like ours were using, and some companies not like ours, and we basically chose somewhere in the middle to start with. That doesn't sound terribly scientific. I probably shouldn't be saying that on a Yale-hosted webinar, but that's the truth.
But do you expect it to align later to Stern Stiglitz and Europe over time? Or how do you see that?
Which Thomas will no doubt say more eloquently than me, is that we aim then to increase it year on year. So and what we're aiming to do here, remember, in our core activity, is we're aiming to future-proof the business for likely carbon prices. Now, you know, as I said, other people may have much better views than me anyway on what those carbon prices are likely to be. But that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to prepare the business for future taxes, which we really think will crystallize. And therefore, the fact that we've set a starting point and then we're increasing from that starting point is the approach we've chosen to take. Thomas, what would you...
No, exactly right. I mean, you know, there are people that will give prizes for having the highest shadow price of carbon, but if it has absolutely no impact on any kind of decision making, it's arguably pointless. We've aimed to have what we think to be a realistic carbon price for near-term introduction by regulators, and therefore that it is something that we believe senior decision makers should be taking into account, rather than a notional cost which reflects arguably the environmental damage of climate change per ton of carbon, from which you could reach obviously a much higher number.
Right. Okay, that's great. So that covers the first set. So I'm going to dip into the second bucket on sort of softer questions and how did you go about it. So I've got a couple here that came online. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges of raising internal awareness? And I'm very aware that your awareness is very high because you've got Mr. Pullman as your CEO, and he's been raising that around the world. But nonetheless, internal awareness, and what's the internal support for applying carbon price on planned investments? What are the obstacles that you had to deal with internally to make it happen?
So I think Thomas touched upon some of those in the prepared remarks. It's absolutely true that we're very lucky to have very strong leadership which makes the position very clear. And it's across the whole of the senior leadership team, that the message is consistent and clear, and has been sort of delivered down, over a number of years to the organisation. But you're right that, if you're an engineer doing a job, trying to build a factory in in a part of the world where there are lots of challenges, both operational and financial and business priorities in terms of timing, you're not sort of sitting at your desk waiting for people to give you new things to do, I guess. And I think the big challenge was that education challenge that Thomas alluded to, in terms of how do we explain to them, what it is they need to do, what information they need to do it, and what will be different as a result of it. And I would say that from my point of view, that's been the main challenge.
Yeah, it's not enough to ask at it from the top, and it's not enough to drive it from the sustainability corner of the business. The question is, how do you get to the middle? How do you get sort of day in, day out? So in terms of issues and problems, I mean, you've been at it for a while. What are the sort of top 3 that you encountered in implementing this?
Thomas?
Let me hazard a guess. Roger may be closer, but I think not all DCFs are the same on a CapEx proposal, but people might like to think they are. So if you're asking someone to run discounted cash flow on, let's take that boiler proposal, they say, well, we did one, last week for this factory over here, and it came out with this answer. So surely the next one is going to come out with the same thing. And so, getting an understanding of how things are changing over time, whether that's technology costs, whether that's carbon prices going up in the real world, as well as our own prices. The fact that this is going to be a changing game forever now, particularly with escalating prices and decreasing technology costs. I think just keeping people more prepared for a more volatile and agile world, which is just a general business challenge, but it applies to carbon pricing too, is one of those issues, because you can get well, we don't need to do this, we know what the answer will be, and so not having that complacency. And I think we've had anecdotal evidence that where we have encouraged more reluctant people to look at different options and run carbon prices, through that evaluation they have uncovered new technology options that they weren't previously aware of. So we are finding it's not that the carbon price changes the decision, but the request to look at alternatives and model those uncovers new technology that we might have previously missed. So I think that's a sort of unintended positive consequence of some of the approaches. And I think the more we share those stories as well, the more people will open up and see this as a positive thing, even if they think they know what the answer of the carbon price calculation itself is going to be.
Yeah. And, okay. Yeah, and I think from the practical perspective, actually finding the training material and actually training right people to do this type of project and getting everybody on the same page was also one of the challenges we had to overcome.
Mm-hmm. No, that's very tricky. So let me go back to the sort of harder questions on the substance. You mentioned 2 really good examples, both from emerging markets, Turkey and South Africa. And it was great to see that, in one case, it supported your decision, the original decision, and in the other case, it actually changed the decision. So I was wondering if you have an example where, despite the numbers, it did not change the decision. And can you describe that? So that's one. And second, you mentioned both emerging markets. So is there any difference in applying it to projects in emerging markets where you perhaps may not have the best available technology available to you compared to doing it in, say, Western Europe? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, so if we sort of start with your final question, I don't think we found that there's a big difference between the availability of the technology in our large emerging markets versus our developed markets. Looking at the kind of things we're looking at in terms of biomass boilers, solar panels, the refrigeration systems and so on, the reality is that the technology is available now in most places. I think that the critical thing, and the reason that the biomass boiler is a nice case, is because the economics of that will vary from country to country. And this alludes back to the point that Thomas made a few moments ago, that we need to keep people looking at these new each time, because clearly the substrates that are available to fire a biomass boiler will vary from location to location, and therefore, and indeed the cost of those substrates will vary, and therefore the answers will be potentially different in different locations from the point of view of the net present value. In most of the cases we've looked at, actually, the decision wasn't swung by the carbon price, which is again why we moved on and added to it the approach of the clean tech fund. And I think that speaks to the fact that for a business like ours, the energy intensiveness is not sufficient such that carbon prices at the sort of likely levels we could foresee are really going to drive decisions. And that's why we needed to add something to the mix to really drive our decision making towards the targets that have been set in terms of our total carbon reductions.
Mm-hmm. So do I hear correctly, Roger, that in most cases it would not be, carbon price would not swing the decision one way or the other? You use the cases where it really does, but in most of the cases it doesn't, even at the price that you set. Is that correct?
Yes, that's our experience so far, yes.
Okay, so going back to nuts and bolts, a couple of questions came in wondering whether you could describe the process for collecting emissions data. Are there any issues in collecting the data which are credible? And then using that data to calculate the numbers. The question came in: how much of an operational budget of a unit goes to the internal fund, and is it meaningful? And is it a large number and therefore meaningful in the fighting?
So, in terms of the first question, if I take you back to our first chart with the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan on, I talked a little bit about the fact that we had set up the plan to look across our total value chain. And therefore, we were already measuring our footprint across our value chain for greenhouse gas emissions, for water, and for waste. And for us, that was a huge benefit. Now, I would be doing Sabina a huge disservice if I now talk too much about that, because the reality is that she has spent more time understanding what's in that model to create our footprint. But it has been an investment over a period of time to really understand what our footprint is. And one of the benefits of that is that we've then been able to apply it to look at our greenhouse gas emissions by business unit. And from that, the calculations in terms of what the clean tech fund should be and the necessary calculations for it. So that is a huge advantage for us, and we're very kind of lucky and grateful to our predecessors and current colleagues in our R&D and science areas who've been able to kind of create that platform of information that we can work from. In terms of the question on the operating budget, it's that we aren't currently piloting anything in the main business on deductions from operating budgets. The things we're doing are focusing on the CapEx budgets. And it's a significant proportion. It's not a huge proportion of our CapEx budgets, but it's meaningful. When you take 50 million out of people's CapEx budgets, they really notice it. So it's a meaningful amount. The place where OpEx budgets would come into play would be in the cases of Ben & Jerry's and Seventh Generation, where, again, I don't fully understand the precise details of their schemes, but they might well affect the operating budgets. But that's not the case in the main Unilever approach.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Couple of questions came on Scope 3, and you did mention that Ben & Jerry already is using it. I know from our experience that this is an extremely difficult issue, and for your products, you are sourcing from many, many markets, many countries. You are dealing with commodity supply chains. So any thought that you can offer on that and how you plan to handle it going forward?
So yes, as you say, very challenging. I'll have a first go, and then by all means, Thomas, Sabina, chip in. I would say that that is the big question. How do we as Unilever really look across our total value chain? And again, anyone who looks at the website will see all the analysis we've done in recent years in terms of the progress we've made in some areas to really move forward a lot, and other areas where we found it harder to move forward in terms of reducing our footprint across that total value chain. And the place probably where we made the most progress has been within our own operations, so the area we've been talking about in this call. So clearly the thought is that the challenge, well, can you then start to use carbon pricing to think beyond the walls into Scope 3. And you know, at the moment, I would say we haven't got deeply into that. It's something that we've looked at sort of superficially and thought about it, but the focus, you know, in real work terms so far has been on really working on the internal carbon pricing schemes that we've talked about today. Because the complexity of applying it in a broader way, and perhaps in some cases the unintended consequences of not getting it right in terms of decision making and so on are very challenging. But I would absolutely envisage that, you know, looking forward, that is going to be something we're going to have to look at. Because if you think of this in very practical terms, if governments do start introducing carbon prices, it is going to start affecting our supply chain. Our suppliers are going to have to start bearing those costs. And of course, that will then have implications across the value chain and through the entire economic model. So it's a step beyond where we've currently gone, but it's a step that I can foresee that we are indeed going to need to take in the coming years. Thomas, anything with that?
I fully agree with that. I think there's a bit of a myth out there that Unilever can single-handedly save the world on its own, and I'm sorry to disillusion anybody, but it's just not. It's not true. I mean, our Scope 3 emissions are somebody else's Scope 1 emissions. Is my first point. If everyone did Scope 1 and 2 in the way we're doing, we'd be in a better place, and that's why things like Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition and everything else is so important. We have to get everybody doing Scope 1 and 2. About 2/3 of our carbon footprint occurs in the consumer's home. It's the energy used when you take a hot shower, or you make a cup of tea, or you make some soup. Applying a carbon price to that is interesting to give you a perspective on the total carbon value impact across the value chain, but it is unlikely to drive any changes in decisions. We have, as I said before, very strong advocacy programs on trying to get carbon prices into the system, so that the system accelerates its decarbonisation, so that our consumers' footprint, our consumers' energy that they're buying out of the grid or whatever it is lower carbon, and so on. And that feels to us like a more sensible route. But you are of course right. I think we should be thinking about in what way we can use Scope 3 carbon pricing to think about how we develop products in future. Are we coming up with things that are inherently carbon intensive in the way they're used, or things which can be used in a less carbon intensive way? And our view would be that products in that second bucket are likely to do better in future and lead to better business outcomes.
Yeah, thank you, Roger. Thank you, Thomas. It's not just about carbon pricing in your supply chain. It's about sustainability of the entire supply chain that is really at stake. So we're coming almost to an end. We've got about 3 minutes left. So I'd like to shift to the third bucket, which is the future and impact of your decisions, and a couple of questions that I'd like to put up, and you can just answer them. One is, you have been a leader. You have been a leader in sustainability. You have been a leader in carbon pricing. You're a large company, and therefore you have large impacts out in the corporate world. So a couple of our listeners would love to hear how is that going to influence public policies in the main jurisdictions where you operate. And the second thing that comes up is the overall issue of reporting and monitoring. So you have been at this initiative for a while, and colleagues on the line would like to know how you evaluate impact of those policies internally and the resulting savings, and also where can public view, if and where public can view these analysis that you may have done. And then closing words, if you will, as well. We'll have to wrap up with your part.
So Thomas, did you want to
kick off? Start on the policy piece. So I talked a little bit to that just now. One of our primary aims in getting in early on carbon pricing is to show the art of the possible. It's it feels wrong to be sort of wagging the finger at other people saying you should be doing carbon pricing. We should be having carbon pricing in the economy. If you can't also show at the same time that you can bring carbon pricing into a business context, and the business can continue to be successful. Because I think that is what is at the back of economic decision makers' minds, is if you say, well, if I start pricing carbon in a different way, that's going to slow my growth, or it's going to do this, that, and the other. We fundamentally disagree with that perspective, and we wanted to just play a small part in trying to prove that to be the case, along with the many others in this field. So, you know, we hope that by leading by example, by showing that it's not just a sort of passing the buck exercise of saying, well, we can't do anything, you just have to price carbon, which I think some parts of the business community have been accused of saying, yeah, well, we'll just wait for the global carbon price to be in place and then it'll all happen. And we know that, you know, it's not a case of business sitting on its hands waiting for government to act. It has to be business, government and civil society acting together in exactly this kind of conversation, in exploring what works and what doesn't, and trying to accelerate progress. So yes, this is all done in the spirit of partnership and trying to show what's possible in and encouraging governments to be braver in the policies that they bring in, whether that's carbon pricing or in the first instance fossil fuel subsidy removal, which is a negative carbon price.
Thank you, Thomas. And disclosure, monitoring, reporting, and disclosure. Any parting words?
So in terms of disclosure, I mean, I think it's worth mentioning the work of the Task Force on Climate Disclosure. We're, you know, actively involved with that, and we're actively working on how we ourselves can improve our disclosure in order that you know, investors and others have a much better platform of information to compare companies and understand what they're doing to prepare themselves for climate change and so on. So that we think is important, and again, there's a long road to go in terms of really having a good platform of information available. But clearly things have changed a lot, you know, in the last few years I've been involved, and we certainly hope that the Task Force on Climate Disclosure will help move that on further. And on impact measurement, again, I think we'd be relatively humble on that. It's on Sabina and my work plan for this year. I think where our thinking is so far is we really want to try and be as good as we can at actually measuring the impact in terms of the thing we're looking at. So if it were to be, you know, carbon emissions, we want to look at you know, tons of carbon, and we found a way of talking about that in monetary terms. But there are some others where we really don't yet think that we're ready to start turning all kinds of impacts into monetary terms. So at the moment, our focus is really on trying to measure the impact rather than rushing into monetizing. So that's not currently our priority outside the area of carbon pricing.
Great.
So in terms of closing comments, look, thank you very much for having us on the call. We hope that what we've shared has been of some interest and use, and of course we look forward to hearing other stories and any feedback so that we too can learn. Thank you.
Great. Roger, Sabina, and Thomas, thank you very much for joining us. And we are now going to close this part of the session, and we're going to move on to Ecofys. We have with us Long Lam, who is a senior consultant on climate strategies and policies from Ecofys. Long, the floor is yours.
Hi. Great. Thanks, Alberta, for the introduction. And many thanks for the Unilever team for the great insights and the internal carbon pricing approaches. And I can certainly say that there are many best practice elements in there. So, and to help more companies to take up best practice approaches on internal carbon pricing, Ecofys, the Generation Foundation and CDP have developed a set of best practice guides to corporate internal carbon pricing. So these guides were developed under the partnership that Ecofys has with the Generation Foundation, the Carbon Pricing Unlock Partnership. And we based these guides on a series of interviews we had with companies that we found having good practice internal carbon pricing approaches, and the public disclosure database of CDP. And what we found was that generally, the internal carbon pricing approaches, or the reasons why companies use internal carbon pricing, can be grouped into three goals. Some companies, they want to use it to demonstrate climate leadership by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. Then there's a really large group of companies that mainly use it to identify financial risks and build resilience against these risks related to, let's say, climate change. And then finally, there's a smaller group, but still growing group of companies that use internal carbon pricing to find opportunities to capitalize on the low carbon transition and to seize them. And the thing is that these goals are not mutually exclusive. As you've heard from the Unilever story, you can use different approaches to also achieve different goals. So, and these goals can be further broken down into, let's say, operational objectives, which you can see on the screen. So what's interesting to realize is that with certain types of objectives that you set, you can achieve more than one goal at the same time. But most importantly, what the Unilever team also alluded to already is that you should have a clear idea of what you want to achieve in your internal carbon pricing approach already from the start. So what are the objectives that you want to achieve? Because it's important to determine the objectives, as it will influence what type of internal carbon pricing approach would work best for what you want to achieve with it, or even whether internal carbon pricing approach is the right instrument for you at all. And there are circumstances where internal carbon pricing may not be the best tool to use. An example could be if all your emissions come from electricity and you already have decided to go 100% renewable, and you know exactly when you want to do it and what kind of measures you want to implement. Or if you want to collaborate with your suppliers to reduce your carbon footprint, because that's the majority of your emissions, that's where it comes from, but using financial incentives won't change their behavior. These are, let's say, two examples of when internal carbon pricing may not be the best approach. But then in many other circumstances, internal carbon pricing can be a powerful tool to integrate, in the end, the low carbon transition into your business decisions. Because essentially you're turning an issue of greenhouse gas emissions that mainly sits with the sustainability team to, you translate it into financial terms, and then it also becomes interesting for your finance team. And the other nice thing about internal carbon pricing is that you can achieve multiple objectives at the same time. And so depending on what these objectives are, you can use either internal carbon pricing as a form of a shadow price. So in capital expenditure decisions, as in Unilever is doing, or you can also do it in the procurement decisions, or in the research and development decisions, and even operational decisions. But then there are also many companies that slowly now starting to realize, okay, it doesn't have enough impact. And so then they actually start charging this internal fee for it, like with the Clean Tech Fund that Unilever has, or the Ben & Jerry's and Seventh Generation example, where they charge a fee on mainly operational decisions and the associated greenhouse gas emissions on that. And then in this way, try to change behavior of managers and decision makers. And you can collect this money into a central fund to, in the end, to support suppliers or to reward people or personnel on low carbon behavior, or purchase even offset credits to achieve carbon neutrality. These are different ways that you can use internal carbon pricing. And so the question is then, how do you get from, let's say, just having your objectives and knowing clearly what your objectives are to an actual approach? So to help with that, we've developed a four-dimensional framework for companies to structure their thinking and designing their internal carbon pricing approach in a best practice way. And so with the four dimensions, the first dimension is the height dimension, which most people know and think about. So how high is the carbon price? And for it to be ultimately a best practice approach, it should at some point rise to a carbon price that's capable of changing decisions in line with the objectives that you have set for your internal carbon pricing approach. And then there's the width dimension. So how widely applied is internal carbon pricing in your company? What kind of emissions does it cover? And it would be moving towards best practice if it ultimately covers all the greenhouse gas emission hotspots that your company can influence and that you already have not yet covered by a different type of policy. So these are the two dimensions that most companies focus on. And together they form, let's say, the carbon value of the greenhouse gas emissions. So what is the cost of greenhouse gas emission to be taken into account in decisions? But the thing is that just these two dimensions don't say what kind of impact it has on investment decisions. As Thomas already said in one of the questions, you can set a very high carbon price, but if it doesn't have any influence in your decisions, it doesn't make any impact. So that's where we introduced the depth dimension. So how deeply is it embedded in your organization and in your decisions? What kind of influence does it have? And this influence can range from, let's say, just being informative in a qualitative manner to just actually using it as a cost metric, as what Unilever is doing with the CAPEX shadow price, or actually charging companies or charging business units for it internally, and using this fund for climate action, such as Clean Tech Fund or the Ben & Jerry's and 7th Generation examples. And these three dimensions, they form, let's say, the impact that the internal carbon pricing approaches have in your company. Each of these dimensions are relatively though, because the company circumstances are different, and there may be even good reasons why you may not want to start on the maximum level of each of this dimension for your company. For example, if your competitive position doesn't allow it, or if you have a lack of data for certain parts of greenhouse gas emission. So then that's where the time dimension comes in. So the time dimension means that an internal carbon pricing approach should be evaluated regularly, so that the approach keeps meeting its objectives and then ultimately contributing to a journey of bringing a company's business strategy in line with the transition to a low carbon economy. So the challenge will be for us to find the optimal combination between these four approaches, which then should form a best practice way to go forward with internal carbon pricing for companies. So we brought all these examples and let's say this framework and this flow diagram, we brought it together in 2 practice guides, which we complemented with some practical examples for companies that we interviewed, as well as some additional companies from Disclosure Database. With the first guide is a C-suite guide. It's a short version to pique the interest of executives for internal carbon pricing. And hopefully when they are interested then they will ask some of the team members to look at internal carbon pricing in more detail and hopefully in the end also design it. So that's why we also made a how-to guide on the corporate internal carbon pricing, which is a step-by-step guide with each sub-step containing a practical example how companies have done the internal carbon pricing approach design step, and then hopefully guiding the implementing team through, in the end, having a best practice internal carbon pricing approach. So you can find these guides online, and of course, if you have any questions or you're interested in talking to us, of course, we're always open to contact us.
Great. Long, excellent. Thank you very much for this very clear and focused presentation. So there are a few questions for you from the audience coming in. So they are bucketed roughly into 2 buckets. One, sort of what's the latest and greatest in trends that you are seeing, and a second, sort of more technical width and height of applications. So I'm going to start with a more technical one, and there are 2 of them. So we've seen that the price that companies are applying, the height in your terminology, determines how seriously it is taken within the companies. And so the question that we have here is, how far within company operation does this make a difference? How high you go? What's the height of that? And on the width, another question that we have is, we've seen companies applying it to bulk of emissions, which could be 80–90% of emissions, but that accounts for a relatively small part of the company's operations. You can go wider, but you create a lot of work and you can cover 99%, but that sort of probably takes a lot more work than the companies are willing to do. So what's your wisdom on that? So height, impact, and width, how far can you go and how deep do you go?
Yeah, so let's start with height. So height, there are different ways that you can set your internal carbon pricing approach. So one example is the Unilever approach, where they basically look at peers. So benchmark against peers. What are others doing and what should we be doing? And also to anticipate what could be a future external carbon pricing policy. But you can also look at past decisions and say, okay, instead I want to determine my price based on what a price that actually will change decisions. So you basically reverse the question. There's a simple way to do that, which is just look at past decisions and then do calculations. A more complicated way to do that is to make a what's called in climate speak a marginal abatement cost curve, to do a very complicated technical analysis of what does each measure cost, translate it in tons of CO2, and then find, let's say, a price that would enable these investments to be made. So the height is really depending on how you fill it in, and it varies per company, because for some companies that have easy measures they can implement, it can be a very low price, whereas for others that have, let's say, done a lot already or are in an area where only new technology would influence their decisions, then the price will be higher. So on width, that's an interesting question also. What kind of emissions should you cover? And that's why we, the best practice guide would say, well, it's important to first focus on the greenhouse gas hotspots. So where are the key sources of your emissions, and understand them? How do they develop? Because if your emissions are very, say, distributed, and you start also focusing on small sources, indeed, yes, you will have a lot of administrative costs, and it will cost a lot of data. And there may be other better policies than internal carbon pricing to influence those decisions and those emissions. So internal carbon pricing is not a all-solving tool, but is a tool in a large suite of tools that can be used to address the whole climate challenge and reduce emissions. And so what we've noticed with a lot of companies is they first, of course, try to influence their Scope 1 emissions, and then slowly start tracking Scope 3 emissions, so in their value chain, and then work together. You can either directly work with suppliers and say in procurement decision, okay, I'm going to look at emissions associated with material I buy and put a price on it. There are not that many companies that do that yet. Or you can say, well, instead of doing a very strict approach, I collect a fund and then use internal carbon pricing way to distribute the funds with the suppliers and cooperate with them, find the most cost-effective approach to reduce emissions. And that's another way to do it.
Okay, so do I hear your recommendation that the width, when you go for 80% coverage, you are good enough rather than shooting for 99.9% coverage, I suppose?
Yeah, you should always find a balance between cost, administrative cost, and accuracy.
Okay, so that's a great advice to our listeners and viewers on a webinar. So you're working with a lot of companies in Ecofys, and we had a privilege of working with you as well. So we know the quality of your work. So what are the main challenges that you see with your clients when you advise them, and what will be your top 1 or 2 and your recommendation on how to overcome those challenges?
Yeah, so the main challenges, one is getting people to accept internal carbon pricing as a tool in the company. So the acceptability can be for quite some companies a big challenge. And our advice is to engage the business from the start. And that's what we also say in the guide. So step 1 is actually engaging the business with internal carbon pricing, make them understand what kind of benefits can it bring them, and how can it help them instead of, let's say, just costing them money or changing decisions. So to not only approach it from, let's say, a negative perspective, but also from an opportunity perspective as well. And what helps also is to get some of the high-level board members on board, especially the finance people. And so that's one recommendation. And the second recommendation I would say is that internal carbon pricing approach can get overly complicated very soon. You can have long discussions about price, what kind of emissions you cover, what kind of decisions should influence, and then everyone has a different opinion. And maybe in some companies, well, they do want it to cover them because they think maybe they will get some money out of it in the form of a fund. And in some other companies, they like, no, we don't want to be involved. It's too much of a hassle, administrative cost. So what's important is to have clear communication and keep it simple at the start. You can always, let's say, expand your approach along the dimensions. And in different ways. In some companies, they will only respond and they will only change behavior if the price is really high. Whereas in some other companies, they will actually, finance people will say, no, we don't want a high price. So the company culture influences your design of the internal carbon pricing approach a lot as well. So taking those two things together in the end, yeah, internal stakeholder consultation is very important.
Thank you, Long. So the last question that we have, I suspect we have a lot of sustainability champions on the line on this webinar, colleagues who need to go and pitch this to their finance executives and to their business executives. So if you were to give us 30 seconds elevator pitch that helps us make sure that people in finance and business buy into it, help us out, what would that be?
Well, it's quite a challenge because in the end, every company is different. But what is important is to focus on to make the business case for internal carbon pricing and to have actual evidence. And you can do that in different ways. You can have evidence through interviews, and we can say, well, we've interviewed these people and they're all on board from the bottom because they see these opportunities. And we've done some calculations internally, and we show that if we use this carbon price, then we can save X amount of energy. And this translates to X amount of euros. And we can use this money to invest in new projects or new business to grow the business from the opportunity side.
Excellent. Great elevator pitch, Long. Thank you very much. So we're coming to an end of our webinar. So I will attempt to summarize a little bit what we heard. So very, very briefly, from Unilever, I am taking away a couple of things. First of all, leadership in a business is possible, and business does not have to wait till the government and the public sector sorts everything out and can be a leader in this. The second point that I'm taking out of Unilever is it is more relevant that we speak in euros rather than in tons of emissions, because people will listen when we speak in euros. And I think we had it confirmed from Ecofys as well. The third takeaway is that scope 3 is someone else's scope 1 and 2. And keeping it relatively simple but impactful is probably much more important than getting all the details right. And Long, from your presentation, there's a couple of things I think I'm taking out, and hopefully our audience will take out as well. Is that first of all, we need to engage businesses in this conversation. This is not a public policy conversation. This is a business conversation. The second thing I took away from you is keep it simple. And while width and height matters a great deal, administrative cost of going for 99.9% precision is probably higher than we would like it to be. And last but not least, I think it's a similar lesson that we had from Unilever is make a business case for it. When we speak a business case, and Unilever showed us amply how they made a business case out of it, creating a fund that gets us much further than going into the details. So those are the things that I'm taking out from the conversation. So I think we're coming slowly but surely to an end of this. I'd like to highlight that we will have another webinar with Yale, with Acciona coming up soon, and you will see the details of it on Yale's site. We are going to collect all your unanswered questions for review and attempt to deal with those questions in the best way possible. And I think the time is up. So thanks to everyone who dialed in. Thanks to tens of questions that we've seen rolling on our screens. Thank you to Unilever, and thank you to Ecofys, Long and Roger, Sabina and Thomas. Thank you very much. Good to talk to all of you, and until next time. Thank you.